Alright, welcome to the second video in my little series on C.S. Lewis's space trilogy. If you weren't here for the first video on Out of the Silent Planet, I recommend you check that out, if only because it's going to be much more educational than this one. In fact, today I want to just kind of tell a silly story that pertains to Perelandra. And like many silly stories, it begins with a road trip. A few years back, some friends and I took a driving tour of the southern US, and we ended up stopping in a little town called Hot Springs down in Arkansas. And as the name implies, this town has a bunch of hot springs that have been drawing people to bathe in its water for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And in fact, the town still has a bunch of old historic bathhouses in it. And so we pulled over, found a place to park, and decided to tour one of them called the Maurice Bathhouse. And inside this old bathhouse, we saw what you would expect to see, a bunch of old and very creepy spa equipment, and some old gymnasium equipment. But there were also a bunch of stained glass windows. And these windows were really pretty. I found myself looking at one, and imagine my surprise when I realized I was looking straight into a scene from Perelandra. It depicted two naked figures riding fish over the surface of a sea with a little bit of land in the background. And to make it even more straight from the book, one of the figures was darker than the other one, almost implying that he was, sunburned. So, no spoilers there, but you can see, if you've read the book, that that is straight from Lewis. And it was on the wall of a bathhouse in stained glass. How did this happen? I was so perplexed by this question that even once I left, I ended up contacting and calling the National Parks Service and asking for any documentation they had on the history of the Maurice Bathhouse. And as you can see, they were more than happy to accommodate me. They gave me way more pages than I expected, and a lot of them were even color pictures of the bathhouse before it was restored, which is kind of cool. And so I was sifting through these pages and going online and looking around as I was weighing the different options. The way I saw it, the most probable option, the first option in my mind, was that C.S. Lewis and the person who made the stained glass windows were both inspired by some common myth or story that had people naked riding on fish. That makes the most sense to me. But as I Googled things and asked my professors, nothing came to the top. Nothing really made sense. There weren't any stories that had that in it. So I had to start thinking about what else it could be. And the next most probable option in my mind was that maybe the stained glass maker was inspired by Perelandra. Because Lewis was famous, maybe they had read Perelandra and just wanted to put it into stained glass, and it ended up in the Maurice Bathhouse. That sounds fair to me. But then I learned, through digging through the documents and the websites, that the Maurice Bathhouse was refinished in 1915, and that's when the stained glass was ordered for the bathhouse. C.S. Lewis didn't write the Perelandra until 1943, nearly 30 years later. So it is impossible that the bathhouse was inspired by C.S. Lewis. That takes me to the third possibility. Maybe, just maybe, C.S. Lewis was inspired by seeing the glass in the bathhouse. And now I know he didn't come to the U.S. and hang out in Arkansas, I don't think, but I had seen that a lot of the glass in the bathhouses were imported from Europe. Maybe, just maybe, since the other things were impossible, C.S. Lewis saw this stained glass window while it was being produced in Europe before it was sent overseas. How cool would that be? Well, as I looked into it more, it turns out this stained glass was actually made by the Rossbach Art Glass Company out of Columbus, Ohio. So it went from Ohio to Arkansas. No C.S. Lewis involved, unless you saw a picture or something. So that didn't make sense either. All three of the main options that made sense in my brain were seemingly impossible. And that just left the idea that maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe people just like drawing other people on fish. I mean, there was that Atlantis movie, so maybe that's a thing. I was disheartened and confused and in the middle of writing my dissertation, so I just gave up on this for a few years and didn't really think about it anymore. But then ChatGPT came along, and the other day, I was just curious, and so I asked Chat if there are any old mythological stories that included naked people riding on fish. And it said no. However, it did say that there are things called the erotes. And they are these collective gods of love and sex that are often seen riding on fish, naked. And that makes sense. Turns out erotes is just the plural of eros. There's a bunch of little eroses running around that depict different aspects of love or sex, and that is who was riding the fish. And it turns out, if you remember, Perelandra takes place on Venus, and it has a lot to do with sensuality, albeit mainly in the context of, like, gastronomic ecstasy. But still, sensuality. And, in fact, the cover of the audiobook on Audible is a naked girl, the queen, from the book. So all of that makes sense of Lewis, and it makes sense in the context of Lewis. He got that from the depictions of the erotes, which is super cool. And it also makes sense of the stained glass itself, because if you remember the border that you saw, the National Park's historians describe it as being composed of lilies and lily pads and cattails, but it also looks like other things too. And that makes sense. That checks out with the fact that there are erotes in the pictures. So I took a very circuitous way of learning about the fact that Perelandra features imagery inspired by the erotes. And you might be thinking, well, you sounded like you wasted a lot of time discovering that, and why are you wasting our time with it now? Fair question. And I just thought, oh, it is valid to know. It's a cool thing to know about Perelandra. But maybe more fun is the fact that it's just a silly Chestertonian adventure. If you remember in Orthodoxy, Chesterton talks about how he set out to find or to make up a religion that would fulfill the different human needs that he's discovered. And he said that after he made it up, he realized that the religion that did that he kind of made up, was just Christianity. And he described it as being like someone who set off to discover a new world and plant his flag on that new world. And he sets sail from England, and he lands on some barbaric coast, and he sets his flag there and claims it for England, and then realizes that he landed on England and had gotten turned around. He said he had all the adventure of discovering a new land, but with none of the danger. And I've had a number of these little adventures throughout my life. Maybe I'll tell more of the stories later. But in this case, I had all the adventure of discovering some wonderful connection to C.S. Lewis's Perelandra in some old stained glass without the need to actually publish anything, because it wasn't that impressive after all. Anyway, I thought it was funny enough to share. I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.
I also want to give a quick shout out to the National Parks Service, because without their help, this whole silly side quest of mine would have been utterly impossible. In fact, when I started this little project, I really thought of them only in the context of those big parks that you think of, like Yellowstone and whatnot. But apparently they're also keeping intricate historical records even of tiny towns like that one down in Arkansas, which is just amazing. That several hundred-page document that I showed you earlier was only about the Maurice Bathhouse, and there are a bunch of bathhouses there in Hot Springs. So that's just a ton of information to maintain and put together. And in addition to that, they also restored the place. It was like a really nasty, dangerous, haunted building beforehand, and now it's just a lovely tourist attraction. And in fact, the picture that I showed you earlier of the stained glass window was actually a duplicate, a replica that they had made of the original, which is still in storage. But I'll pop a picture of the original one up on the screen now because, of course, it was in their historical survey. Anyway, if you see a national parks person, give them some love. All right, cheers.
It's always nighttime when I finish.